So often we think that love is only offered when we are good or think good thoughts. We try to do everything right all the time and berate ourselves when we stumble. Mindfulness and unconditional love challenge that belief. Unconditional means exactly that. You do not need to be on all of the time. Your anger, resentment, depression, fear, shame, embarrassment, etc. are all welcomed and cared for. It's really that simple. With time, that part of you will become automatic. This is the nature of habits. You will eventually start turning to this loving presence rather than the rumination. Instead of trying to control or analyze our thoughts, which keeps us in the feedback loop, love activates different parts of our brain and body. The softer, vulnerable parts that we often disable after trauma in order to protect ourselves. This work will also help you discover the parts of yourself that resist this love, scream at it, scoff at it, doubt it, fear it. Remember, all those parts of you are also welcomed unconditionally. One of the great mistakes that can happen in AA is people trying to force themselves to be better. And self-will cannot overcome self-will. Only God can overcome self-will. So if we want any peace of mind, serenity, and happiness, it looks like we're going to have to turn to a power greater than ourselves, because a selfish, self-centered human being is always scared to death. A person whose mind is filled with resentment, fear, guilt, and shame does not feel good. One cannot solve problems using the same mindset that created them. The main problem is that we only thought of ourselves. Without having God, thinking on a spiritual plane, in our lives, we lived solely through satisfying the three basic instincts of life through external means. This is where self-will comes from. It is plain that a life run on self-will can hardly be a success. The fulfillment of these things are so pleasurable that all human beings from time to time will overdo it in one or more of these areas and create pain and suffering for others. We can't do anything about any other human beings on earth, but we can do something about our relationship with an unconditional loving power greater than ourselves. Learning how to keep our instincts under control, where we don't have to get angry, means that we have much less chance of choosing unhealthy behaviors, and therefore we have much less chance of drinking than if we're stuck in a pattern of continuous anger. It's only by trusting the idea that other possibilities of our looking at things exists that we can be open to the loving guidance that only a power greater than ourselves can bring. It is in welcoming this concept into our consciousness that we may find the proper use of our self-will in satisfying our three basic human instincts. Big Book, page 65. We went back through our lives. Nothing counted but thoroughness and honesty. When we were finished, we considered it carefully. The first thing apparent was that this world and its people were often quite wrong. To conclude that others were wrong was as far as most of us ever got. The usual outcome was that people continued to wrong us, and we stayed sore. Sometimes it was remorse, and then we were sore at ourselves. But the more we fought and tried to have our own way, the worse matters got. As in war, the victor only seemed to win. Our moments of triumph were short-lived. It is plain that a life which includes deep resentment leads only to futility and unhappiness. To the precise extent that we permit these, do we squander the hours that might have been worthwhile. Always before, we looked to see what others had done to us. Now we want to look at things to see what resentment did to us. Big Book, page 66. We turned back to the list, for it held the key to our future. We were prepared to look at it from an entirely different angle. We began to see that the world and its people really dominated us. In that state, the wrongdoing of others, fancied or real, had the power to actually kill. And if they have controlled and dominated my thinking, then they've controlled and dominated my actions. And if they've controlled and dominated my actions, they have absolutely controlled and dominated my entire life. Each of us has always thought that we were in charge, but we suddenly realize that other people have been in charge as far back as we can remember through our resentment towards them. Some of these people have been dead for years, and if we don't want these people, alive or dead, to control our lives any longer, we make a decision in step 3 to let God direct our thinking rather than allowing others to have that power. It's just that simple. Big Book, page 66. How could we escape? We saw that these resentments must be mastered. But how? We could not wish them away with any more alcohol. This was our course. We realized that the people who wronged us were perhaps spiritually sick. Though we did not like their symptoms and the way they disturbed us, they, like ourselves, were sick too. We asked God to help us show them the same tolerance, pity, and patience that we would cheerfully grant a sick friend. When a person offended us, we said to ourselves, quote, "This is a sick man. How can I help him? God, save me from being angry. Thy will be done," unquote. In other words, the way we get even with other people is by praying for them. All of that anger that we intended to use upon them, we are turning on ourselves, making ourselves sick and blaming it on them. Eventually, what we will find is that these people do not change, but our thoughts and feelings towards them does. Forgiveness creates the space for unconditional love to rush in. We are only forgiving them because we acknowledge that we too are not always spiritually well, and sometimes it's been our insane thoughts and actions that may lead others to resent us. Do not confuse this type of spiritual forgiveness of others with dismissing their actions. They are still responsible and accountable for them. If they wish to address past behavior towards us, they are welcome to do so of their own accord. But we do not wish to focus on them changing when healing ourselves. We have tried that all of our lives, and it doesn't work. We will forgive them for being spiritually unwell like ourselves, and wish them healing thoughts on a spiritual level. We need be careful to do this without any expectation that our prayers will affect change in them and their behavior towards us. During this process, others may try to manipulate you into taking the blame for their own wrongdoings and shame you for legitimate anger you may carry over mistreatment and patronize you for not being able to quote-unquote let go of the past. This type of behavior is manipulative and predatory. Do not give second chances to people who express no remorse for their treatment of you, nor that express remorse but continue the same harmful behavior. The forgiveness talked about in step 4 is intended to protect you from such dangerous gaslighting while also freeing your heart to new experiences. Initially, this is not fun, and it may also feel like further unfairness piled on top of the already unfair situation. Quote, "Why should I have to forgive?" unquote, we may ask ourselves. Quote, "Why should I have to deal with these bad feelings because of somebody else's bad behavior?" Unquote. Why should I have to be responsible for letting go or forgiving while they go unpunished? Unquote. It is because this mindset ironically causes more resentment and victimization, which we will eventually turn on ourselves in the form of self-pity. While you may agree that it's not good to harm others, you are still harming someone. You are betraying yourself with every unkind, shameful, or bullying thought against yourself. You should feel just as motivated to resolve this as you would be if you were harming someone else. These feelings of resentment and injustice are exactly what we want to get in touch with because it forms an entire mindset in which everything has become unfair. This is the victim identity. Mindfulness helps you become aware of this thinking without judging it. It is the nature of emotional wounding. It changes our entire perspective, the lens through which we view the world and ourselves. The common denominator in our story is ourselves and not the world. Breaking beyond this belief allows us to be free and live in the present moment. You should not feel the need to do anything as you work on forgiveness. This is an internal process, not one involving reconciliation or contact. Forgiveness is not asking you to pretend that what happened wasn't bad. It's acknowledging the pain and accepting that it was real so that you can learn from it and let it go. This process is not so much about forgiving or loving the perpetrator as it is about letting go of the victim mindset that comes from betrayal. Essentially, a life event has taught us that bad things are happening to us. We have internalized the story, and our bodies react in kind. But we can release the story the same way it formed. To forgive, you're going to need to adopt a new story whereby you begin to understand that you were harmed by someone else's self-will run riot, who, like ourselves, has been disconnected from unconditional love emanating from a power greater than themselves, and therefore also extremely misguided. There is no blame here. There are no bad guys, only wounded souls, broken hearts, and scrambled minds. You needn't dig into someone else's past to understand why they mistreated you. This will only suck you into the same old patterns of feeling sorry and sympathetic, which will only invite more of their misbehavior. Some people have perfectly fine lives and still treat others like garbage. The point is, this isn't really about them. It's about releasing the messages they left behind in you. It will not be accomplished through a one-time forgiveness of oneself, but rather in learning to live in a continuous state of forgiveness. When others hurt you, this is a reflection of their own demons. They didn't hurt you because there was something defective about you. They hurt you because of their own sense of inner defectiveness that someone likely passed along to them a long time before they had any idea what to do with it. By letting go the story of betrayal, we are leaving behind an old world. We are no longer defined by the traumatic event, but instead through the unconditional love of our higher power that has freed us from it. Forgiveness becomes much easier as we begin to learn that our old shame-based beliefs aren't true. We see that someone else was acting out their own demons, and we recognize that it had nothing to do with us. We stop seeing our suffering as a personal attack. Instead, we begin to see our suffering from a less personal, bigger picture perspective, and discover how to use our past in ways that will help ourselves by passing on what we have learned about our shortcomings to others. As a result, the feeling of forgiveness will become light and joyful, almost humorous, as the tension in our chest dissolves. Our thinking was the resentment. God's thinking is love, patience, tolerance, compassion, and goodwill. God dwells within us, but we could never use this knowledge properly. In the chase for money, property, prestige, sex, and what we thought were the good things in life, we had to repress God's thinking in order to operate on the level that we wanted to operate on. Big Book, page 67, quote, referring to our list again, putting out of our minds the wrongs others had done, we resolutely looked for our own mistakes. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened? Though a situation had not been entirely our fault, we tried to disregard the other person entirely. Where were we to blame for our resentment? The inventory was ours and not the other person's. When we saw our faults, we listed them. We placed them before us in black and white. We admitted our wrongs honestly and were willing to set these matters straight, unquote. In our pursuit to satisfy our three basic instincts, what did we do, if anything, to set in motion the circumstances which in turn caused people or institutions to hurt us and eventually led to our resentment of them for doing so? If we hadn't been selfish, dishonest, or self-seeking, we wouldn't have been out there doing things that had hurt others. Fear drives us to do things like that. If we stay frightened and behave inconsiderately, we're going to keep on doing the same old things that we've always done. But what if we could become a little less selfish, a little less dishonest, a little less self-seeking, and a little more considerate of others? Maybe we wouldn't hurt people, maybe they wouldn't retaliate, and maybe we wouldn't need to resent them. A justified resentment blocks one off from God, which is thinking on a spiritual plane of unconditional love, just as much as an unjustified one does. If they hadn't done that to me, then I wouldn't have to be the way that I am today. They call that victimization. Whatever has happened to us in the past does not have to control what we do today. The only reason to choose to think that way is to justify one's resentment. Sometimes we'd rather sit in today's pain and suffering than take a chance on changing in the future because we are scared of what that change will bring. If we stay selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, frightened, and inconsiderate, it's got to be because that's the way we want to be. So, if you've got a resentment in your head today, it's not true. If you've got a resentment in your head today, it's not true. Oh, it was based on truth and is partially true, but you've distorted it. It's no longer true. Can we honestly look at this idea and see the truth behind it? Everyone wants to be the victim of something, but in AA we won't let each other do that because we have a way out. When everything else fails, we can pray for them. They need the prayers and we need the practice. So our fourth step inventory has shown us, 1, the worst thing about a resentment is that it blocks us off from the unconditional love of God or our higher power. We don't feel good, and we begin to become insane in thought and action. 2, when God's thinking is allowed to replace our resentments, we're much less likely to get drunk. We're smarter than we were before we started this process. 3, we found that in almost all cases, whatever the resentment was, we ourselves did something to set it in motion. 4, we discovered that just about every time we had hurt anybody in the past, it was either through selfishness or dishonesty, or because we were self-seeking or frightened, or through inconsideration of other people. 5, we will need to change our personality if we want to live with peace of mind, serenity, and happiness in the future. If we practice this healthier way of thinking, our resentments disappear, and they are replaced with patience, tolerance, compassion, and goodwill. Now, we don't want to give you the impression that you can be 100% free of resentments. It depends upon how we view and deal with things on whether they become bad or not. A resentment used right can be used for a worthwhile purpose. If somebody does something that threatens our self-esteem, and if it would cause us to look at ourselves and see some things that we need to change, then we go ahead and make those changes, then that resentment can be used for a worthwhile purpose. The ones that kill us are those that we just leave in our heads, and they fester and fester and fester, and we get sicker until it creates a real problem for us. So if you've got a resentment that you don't want to get rid of, for God's sakes, don't pray about it. Because if you do, you're going to lose it. If you have a resentment that you want to be free of, if you will pray for that person or thing that you resent, you will be free, even if you don't really want it for them. Or your prayers are only words and you don't mean it. Do it anyway. Do it every day for 2 weeks. And you may find that you come to mean it for them. And you may realize that where you used to feel bitterness and resentment, you now feel compassionate understanding and love, because they, like ourselves, are hurt, misguided, and spiritually sick. This is how our thinking will come to exist on a higher plane through using this simple spiritual exercise. This is how we will become conscious of experiencing unconditional love instead of being consumed by our alcoholic mind. We will come to understand that Unconditional love is forgiving, and unconditional love is forgiving. The set-aside prayer helps summarize the core goals of the fourth step. Quote, God, today help me set aside everything I think I know about you, everything I think I know about myself, everything I think I know about others, and everything I think I know about my own recovery, so I may have an open mind and a new experience with all these things. Please help me see the truth. Summary of steps 1 through 4. Step 1 asked us if we were willing to put aside our fixed ideas of who we believe ourselves to be in order to be open to change. This includes the idea that our limited mental abilities might lead us to insane ways of thinking defined as, quote, the lack of proportion of the ability to think straight, unquote. Step 2 asked whether we were open to the possibility that the way that we perceive ourselves may be flawed, and that the only way we will be able to see a more realistic view of ourselves is with the help of something besides us. Sanity is a wholeness or completeness of mind. A mind that is whole means that one can see the truth about everything around it, including themselves. Step 3 asks us to state clearly our view of any given situation as the reality that we are currently experiencing. Next, we are asked to make a decision on whether to act on that perception alone or instead be willing to challenge that view by trusting in something greater than ourselves. It is this concept of an unconditionally loving power of our own creation that will help us look at our own beliefs and behaviors in non-judgmental ways, because we are incapable of loving ourselves without judgment. For it is only when the many requirements that we have placed upon ourselves are met that we begrudgingly allow ourselves to feel love. Due to this, we are constitutionally unable to acknowledge uncomfortable and at times painful truths about ourselves. We delude ourselves by creating our own reality that prevents us from having a wholeness or completeness of mind. Our limited mental abilities have attempted to protect us from the pain associated with our unfulfilled expectations in the form of resentments. And it is our need to constantly replay these self-serving memories that has led us to the torturous situation that we now find ourselves in. Step 3 asks us to acknowledge the shortcomings and flaws in our thinking and accept the undeniable truth that it is impossible for any of us to recover our sanity without the help of a power greater than ourselves. Step 4 provides a methodology by which we can separate our feelings that are rooted in the desire to satisfy one or more of our 3 basic human instincts by examining our resentments, which are in fact our own unfulfilled expectations. We will need the strength, hope, and unconditional love that only something greater than ourselves can provide during the process of writing inventories and learning how to interpret our feelings using the 4 primary emotions, and from this simple exercise understand how these emotions affect our views of ourselves, which directly control our thoughts and actions, and in time will reveal the unhealthy thinking patterns that have created such misery and unhappiness in our lives. If you have been thorough in your working of step 4, congratulations. You have made a good beginning and have swallowed and digested some big chunks of truth about yourself. The result of this exercise is to enable us to better understand who we truly are, and that we will be empowered by this information in choosing healthier ways of dealing with life's problems.